All right, we're plugging right along with the When the Night Comes Falling by Howard Blum, and I got Xander, the little crime-fighting kitten, with me today. He is really putting up a fight. So, fighting crime. You are fighting crime. Anyways, actually, I'm just holding him because I'm trying to get him to quit climbing the curtain behind me, and he's not having no part of it. Look at that. He's a squirmy little bastard. Anyways, I'm going to let him down, but we'll see how this goes. Anyways, I want to get into chapter 14. We're going to plug right along with this book. And this is not a very long chapter. I will be reading about half of it, maybe, or less. And there's not a lot to it. So this should be a short one. This hopefully will be about 30 minutes tops. But I want to keep plugging through this book as at a decent pace. And I've got a little bit of time before I go live. I'm going to go live here in about an hour and a half on my regular schedule. So let's go ahead and hit When the Night Comes Falling, chapter 14. Now this one is going to be after the murders. And we're going to skip ahead again now to the drive back to Pennsylvania. Bryan Kohberger and his father, Michael Kohberger, in the car. The book starts with that. Now the book's circling back to it. Hell, will probably end with it. It almost feels like Howard Blum had a major interview with Michael Kohberger about this particular drive and made it the centerpiece of his book. But I don't know. That's neither here nor there. Now I want to talk to you about something really quick before we get into this particular one. Confirmation bias. This is something, I've got my glasses on. I didn't have my glasses for the last video. Whatever. So, confirmation bias. I will admit, I want to tell you, I try to be fair and let you know when I acknowledge these things in myself. This chapter has some things that confirm certain feelings that I have had, or at least not confirm, it's not the right word, that lend support to my own personal theories. And it's interesting because part of me will say to you, if you can believe anything that Howard Blum says, because a lot of what he's saying, and look at that, the cat's tearing up the frickin' curtain behind me. This is what I'm talking about. He may have to go to the other room. Anyways, so on the one hand, I'll tell you, I'm not sure you can believe anything that Howard Blum says. On the other hand, I acknowledge that when Howard Blum says something that I feel supports what I already have come to have a gut feeling about, like, for example, what happened at the Corner Club that night and the Jack DeCoeur ex-boyfriend thing. That's a theory I've been working on, is one I feel in my gut has more meat to it than the Bryan Kohberger story. And so when he covers what happened at the Corner Club, I will admit I'm more inclined to believe Howard Blum is depicting something that we should pay attention to. Other times I'm thinking to myself, Howard Blum can blow it out his ass, he's not correct. And that might be because of my own personal biases of I don't think that's how it happened, so Howard Blum is incorrect. So I want to acknowledge, for the record, I am also influenced by bias. The only difference is between Howard Blum and I is Howard Blum will just tell you what he believes, and like it's a fact. I'll at least tell you when I think I'm being biased. And so there's going to be moments in this chapter where I feel like I'm being biased, and I'll point those out to you, unlike maybe Howard Blum. So let's go ahead and get into this. And again, that cat behind me is about to lose his little frickin' mind. All right, chapter 14, When the Night Comes Falling, and now we're talking about Michael Kohberger and Bryan Kohberger driving back a month after the murders, and when they're pulled over twice by police in a short period of time. And now this is the one that I want you to pay attention to, that I got highlighted right off the bat. This is about this whole confirmation bias. And Michael, as he would later confide, was beginning to think that what had been building in his imagination since his arrival in Pullman was either everything or nothing. Either he had been chasing shadows, or what he could not bring himself to articulate, not even Marianne, not to his daughters, and certainly not to Bryan, was true. Now, what I'm focusing on this word confide, and what Michael, as he would later confide, was beginning to think. Okay, so what that means to me is, if you can believe what Howard Blum says, then it suggests to me that Howard Blum had a conversation with Michael Kohberger, and Michael Kohberger confided in him. That's what I would say the word confide means. It's not an opinion. It's Michael has confided in him, in confidence, that he was already suspecting his son of being the person who committed the murders in Idaho before he came to pick him up in Pennsylvania. So if that's true, and I tend to think that it might be true, Bryan Kohberger's own family, to some extent or to a large extent, depending on how you do the numbers, believes that their son probably is the one who did it. That says a little bit, right? That if your own family believes that you're the kind of person capable of doing this, that's a bad thing. And we already know from what I've seen, I should say, what I have seen is that Amanda Kohberger, or one of Michael's sisters, I'm not even sure if it was Amanda, one of Michael's sisters is likely the one who called in Bryan Kohberger. She turned him in before when he stole her phone when they were younger. That cat is cruising for a effing bruise, and I'll tell you what, crime-fighting cat my ass. Anyways, I'm not violent to kitties, by the way. I love animals. But the point being is, there is indications that Kohberger's own family thinks that he's the type of person who could do this. And according to Howard Blum, Michael, his father, confided that he was already suspicious of Bryan before they got there. Now, it kind of, I don't know. Leave it what it is. And again, Marianne, who seems to be Michael Kohberger's mother, she appears not to, at this point, believe that her son is the one, and is standing by her son's side. So this may be just as again, I'm telling you, I'm just thinking out loud and sharing my thoughts, and I'll let you know I'm not stating it as fact. This may be dividing this family, right? There's half the house, maybe Michael Kohberger and one of Bryan Kohberger's sisters, who thinks that he's guilty and already believes or already suspects that he's guilty. And then perhaps his mother, and we don't know about the other sister or whatever, may think that maybe they got the wrong guy and are waiting to see what happens in a court of law. But the point being is that this may be dividing the family. And how bad will it look for America if his own family thinks that he's capable of doing this kind of thing? So take it for a grain of salt. I spent more time on that than I expected to have on it. Okay. Michael nodded politely towards the deputy. This is talking about when they're pulled over. The first time they're pulled over in Indiana, they're on their way back, and Brent Kopacka has just been shot and killed in Pullman, Washington early that morning, and now they're getting pulled over in Idaho, in Indiana, as they're traveling back east to Pennsylvania, where Michael Kohberger and his family live. And Michael nods politely to the deputy who's pulled them over, but also chose not to speak. Michael wasn't driving. He was not the one pulled over. Bryan was the one pulled over. Michael's in the passenger seat. And Michael nods politely to the deputy and chose not to speak like Bryan. They were both kind of quiet and letting the officer tell them what they're pulled over for. And perhaps he too understood the value of silence, although more likely it was that he was too tense to find any words. This cat is climbing my back. That is horrendous. If you don't know how sharp little kitty's claws are, it is horrendous every single time that cat leaps on my back and then hangs from my flesh. Anyways, it's a short video, so I allowed Xander to be in the room. Maybe that was a bad choice. So again, they're painting the picture that Michael thinks his son is possibly involved in the murders, and is fearing as they get pulled over that, oh shit, this is what I thought all along. They're pulling my son over because he's the killer, and that's this tense moment in the car. The officer begins, "You were right up on that van, man. I pulled you over for tailgating." With that revelation, both father and son seem to exhale. In an instant, the danger of something much graver has passed, and with their shared relief, a new tempo shapes the encounter. So in other words, he's like, ooh, there was this tense moment you can see on camera. I watched the video. I'm not going to say whether I think Howard Blum is painting it wrong or not, because it's ambiguous. There's a tense moment where and then when the officer says, hey, you're following too close, maybe one can argue they lightened up a little bit. And does that suggest guilt? Were they thinking it was going to be more serious, and it was just getting pulled over for following too close? I don't view that in that video, but that's what he's getting at. Fair. We're going to get some Thai food, Bryan responded earnestly. So the officer asks where they're coming from. And they say, so they tell him that they're coming from WSU, and the officer doesn't know what WSU is. In Indiana, he's like, what's WSU? I don't understand. So they explain it to him. So you're coming from Washington State University, and you're going where? The officer reiterated, as if to say, you're coming from Pullman, Washington, and you're going to go get some Thai food in Indiana. And that's what he says. But Michael could not leave well enough alone. So Bryan's dad decides to start running the mouth. Ever since he had woken to the news from Pullman that morning, he had been trying to make sense of the emotions roiling inside of him. It had been the catalyst that gave concrete shape to the thoughts He'd been trying not to think, and now he could not hold back. He started rambling on about the shooting earlier that day at WSU. So I want to. This is where I'm talking about confirmation bias. There's a part of me that believes there's a connection between Brent Kopacka and Bryan Kohberger and the timing of when they left WSU and when the events happened where Brent Kopacka is shot and killed, and what they know about that shooting and the whole 9 yards. There's a part of me that believes that there's a connection there, that there's things involved, that Brent Kopacka's phone, after the SWAT team shot and killed him that morning, factory wiped his phone. This was said by his best friend on an interview. It was repeated multiple places that the phone was factory reset. So who factory reset his phone? Who, we don't know. Could it have been the roommates in the house? Could it have been law enforcement? If it was law enforcement, why did they factory reset the phone? Did they not want people to find out what was on Brent Kopacka's phone? It leads to a lot of questions. And if they didn't want anybody to know what was on Brent Kopacka's phone, is it because there was a connection between Brent Kopacka and Bryan Kohberger, and they were already tracking Bryan Kohberger? Now, what we're going to find in this chapter, and again, this is confirmation bias, we're going to find Howard Blum admitting that the FBI had been tracking Bryan Kohberger prior to this event. For weeks prior to this event, the FBI was already on to Bryan Kohberger. Idaho police were not, because we know from court records that have been released that the Idaho police were not informed of Bryan Kohberger's name until December 19th, which is around this time here. So they didn't know about Bryan Kohberger yet, but the FBI had been suspecting Bryan Kohberger, had been investigating Bryan Kohberger, and leading up to the shooting of Brent Kopacka, who lived very close to Bryan Kohberger. And so the question becomes now, is there a connection? Again, I've done a lot of videos showing that Brent Kopacka and Bryan Kohberger both came from Pennsylvania, or at least Brent Kopacka's mother comes from Pennsylvania, and the Kohbergers come from Pennsylvania. And there's people online who say that they were living in the same city together, Brent Kopacka and Bryan Kohberger. And there's a lot of connections. There's a lot of connections circumstantially that suggests that Bryan Kohberger and Brent Kopacka know each other. Now, before you jump on my ass for circumstantial evidence, keep in mind this entire case against Bryan Kohberger is circumstantial. It's no more than doing what I just did. Well, Bryan Kohberger likes vegan food, and two of the girls worked at a vegan restaurant. Therefore, that suggests that he maybe met them at the vegan restaurant. That is no less conjecture and speculation than me saying if Brent Kopacka's family comes from Pennsylvania and the Kohbergers come from Pennsylvania, and if Brent Kopacka was in the same city as Bryan Kohberger, maybe they knew each other, and maybe it's not just a coincidence that the two of them end up in Pullman, Washington, clear across the country, when they lived in the same city back in Pennsylvania, clear across the country, and that's not just a coincidence. I would argue my logic that I just laid out for you, if it were true, is far less of circumstantial evidence than the maybe Bryan was a vegan and maybe he saw the girls at a vegan restaurant, which, by the way, wasn't necessarily a vegan restaurant. It was just a restaurant that served a vegan meal. Anyways, I'm going to not get this done in a half hour if I keep going on tangents. So they start rambling. Michael Kohberger immediately starts rambling about the shooting of Brent Kopacka. So the officer gets confused because both of them are talking at the same time. I've watched the video. Both of them are talking at the same time. Bryan's talking, Michael's talking. There's road noise. It's extremely hard to hear what's going on. It's clear they're talking about a shooting in Pullman, but the officer can't quite hear. Also, there's road noise, so I'm sure the officer is having a hard time hearing two people talk over road noise. So he says, road noise. So he says, "What did you say about some SWAT teams?" the officer asked, alert with new interest. Michael's explanation was laborious. In his discursive way, he seemed determined to share everything except for what really was in front and center of his thoughts. Interesting, the deputy remarked, without apparent interest. So Michael Kohberger is running off at the mouth about this shooting, and it suggests to me that Howard Blum thinks that somehow the shooting is related to Bryan Kohberger. That's super interesting, and that this shooting is at the top of Michael's thoughts, because he's also suspecting that his son's involved in the Idaho 4 murders. You could imply that Blum's trying to suggest that even Michael thinks the shooting in Pullman of Brent Kopacka might be related in some way to his son. Michael, however, was set on having the last word. "Well, it's horrifying," he says. So the officer kind of blows it off. Well, that's interesting. He's like, "No, it's horrifying." Why is it horrifying? But whether he was talking about the shooting that morning or something else was never explained. So in other words, Howard Blum indicates The fact that Michael Kohberger calls the shooting, Michael Kohberger, the father of Bryan Kohberger, calls the shooting in Pullman of Brent Kopacka horrifying. Is he implying that there's something more about that shooting? Or is it something else? We don't know. Howard Blum's guessing. I'm also guessing that there may be a connection there. Bryan, though, must have had his suspicions. Resolved to put an end to any further march through the minefield, he spoke up. We don't know anything about that, actually. We don't know about that, actually. We weren't there for the shooting. The words bristled with indignation. Now, this cat, though, knows Xander. Xander the crime-fighting cat is about to be Xander the flying cat. All right. So I want to go back. Dude. All right. This is where I told you that I have suspicions that there's something there's something up with the Brent Kopacka thing, and the fact that both of them know it was a shooting. Because again, text messages that went out to students on campus about the event that night were, there's an event on campus, stay indoors, the event's over, you can return to class. There was nothing in the text messages to the students of WSU about a shooting. Nothing at all about a shooting. And yet, Bryan Kohberger knows about the shooting. Some have speculated, well, Bryan knows about the shooting because he's a student at WSU, would have got those text messages. The text messages do not talk about a shooting. So then the question is, how did they find out about it? According to what we've heard later, they were listening to it on the news. Was the news covering the shooting in the morning? Maybe. I'll give them that. Maybe it was. So, but regardless of what the situation is, even I felt when I watched the video that Bryan Kohberger wanted to shut down his dad's discussion about the shooting in Pullman, saying, we don't know anything about that. I felt that, I'm just going to get this out there. I thought it was a little odd the way that Bryan responded when he said, we don't know anything about that. You know, he wants to quickly shut down this. His dad's running at the mouth. Well, there was a shooting on the campus. And he's like, we don't know anything about that. We weren't there. And it felt like Bryan wanted to shut his dad up with that whole conversation, which I thought, in my own personal feelings and gut feelings about the Brent Kopacka connection, that I'm wondering, is that another indicator, potentially? So for what it's worth, let me reiterate the difference between Howard Blum and I. I'll tell you, it's pure speculation on my part. It's a hunch that I'm working on my part. And again, it doesn't mean that I say that Bryan Kohberger is the killer. What I'm suspicious about is whether or not he knew Brent Kopacka and whether Brent Kopacka was involved in this in any way. And was Bryan trying to distance himself from Brent Kopacka? That's my gut question. And so it's interesting, speaking about this way longer than I anticipated. We don't know about that, actually. We weren't there for the shooting. The words bristled with indignation. And Michael caught the familiar haughty tone, and he rushed to correct it. We're slightly punchy here because we've been driving for hours, he immediately conceded. So again, Michael, his father, apparently notices as well what I noticed and what Howard Blum is picking up on, that Bryan Kohberger wanted to shut down this conversation about the shooting in Pullman. That needs to... If that's the case, if that's how it happened, and we all are seeing it correctly, that Bryan wanted to quickly shut down the idea that they know anything about the shooting, and that his father catches his sons not wanting to talk about the shooting and shuts that down the conversation, why does Bryan Kohberger want to shut that down? Is there a connection between the shooting and Bryan Kohberger? That's all I want. I keep wanting to beat that to death. Maybe I'll bring out my new animation, beating a dead horse. I'm beating a dead horse here, which is that Bryan Kohberger looks like he wants to shut down any connection between the shooting in Pullman and himself by saying, hey, look, we don't know anything about that. We weren't there. And it looked a little odd to me because I've been investigating the possibility of a connection between Brent Kopacka and Bryan Kohberger. The deputy had enough. Do me a favor, he said to Bryan. Don't follow too closely, okay? And he basically lets them go. But a few minutes later, it says, but the Kohbergers didn't get very far. 9 minutes later, Bryan once more saw flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A state trooper was ordering them to pull over. This cat! Dude! Xander, you are not a crime-fighting cat. You are an asshole. He's like snagged my finger twice underneath the table. He's a brutal. And now I'm hearing him attack something in the background. Anyways, the good thing these are informal. As the white car moved to the shoulder, the Kohbergers must have had a sense that they were condemned to live out the same anxious day in a maddening reoccurrence of the same unnerving events. Or, no less a possibility, they feared that this time their luck had finally run out. This is again another comment by Howard Blum to suggest Bryan Kohberger is the killer. He thinks he's getting caught. He showed signs of relief when the first time he was pulled over was just for tailgating, but he's been pulled over again. Maybe the gig is up. He's actually going to get arrested this time for something he knows he's done. That's what Howard Blum wants us to understand. And it could be that way. It could be that way. This cat is going to die. No, I'm not going to kill a cat. The FBI surveillance team that, now here's where it gets interesting. We're almost done with this chapter. The FBI surveillance team that had been assigned to tail the Kohbergers since they had left Pullman had similar thoughts. So now we know from Howard Blum and whatever his inside sources are that the FBI had been following Bryan Kohberger out of Pullman. He'll also tell us that they've been following him and investigating him for weeks. Their luck, the FBI, they feared, had run out too. There was an iron rule of law enforcement that in any long-running op, the unexpected was to be expected at any time. But twice, and in such a rapid succession, what were the odds? In other words, the FBI had been tracking him for some time. It was an ongoing, long investigation, and the rule of thumb is the longer the investigation goes, something's going to go wrong. So they're afraid to, here it goes, something's going wrong. They worry, for example, if Indiana had been tipped off on the arrest and is going to beat the feds to the arrest. So a ragged procession of unmarked surveillance cars was scattered. This is the FBI cards. A ragged procession of unmarked surveillance cars was scattered up and down I-70, and high in the flat blue Indiana sky, a fixed-wing plane hovered. So now we're being told the FBI is following Bryan Kohberger on his trip back to Pennsylvania. Multiple surveillance vehicles, airplane flying, fixed-wing airplane flying in the sky following the Kohberger's car. They're being watched the entire time on this trip. And not a single one of the many agents in the surveillance operation had any understanding of what had just happened. All they knew was that the long weeks of dogged investigation suddenly seemed headed in the disastrous conclusion. For just as they were at last moving tantalizingly close to solving the mystery, Indiana cops seemed to be ready to smash all their painstaking detective work to smithereens, and the man that they suspected to be the killer of the 4 students would have outsmarted them all. How had it come to this? Into chapter 14. So, where are we at with the situation? 1, the crime-fighting cat is not a crime-fighting cat. He's a crime-fighting asshole. 2, Howard Blum is painting the picture that Michael Kohberger already believes on this drive that his son probably did it and fears the worst. And there's tense moments as they're getting pulled over when they think the gig is up. Bryan Kohberger's going to get arrested. All these things. Is it true? I don't know. I'm putting a lot on Howard Blum's word that Michael confided that he suspected his son. So if that was a personal conversation for this book in which Howard Blum talked to Michael, who, by the way, he referred to Michael as basically not a super bright man, not a super intelligent man, who believes that if you're arrested for something, you must be guilty because it's not hard to figure out why criminals do things. Michael Kohberger literally could have the attitude of, if you are arrested, then you're guilty, because police don't arrest people for things that they didn't do. So therefore, maybe Michael's thought process and this whole thing only goes as far as, oh, well, my son must have done it. He was arrested for it. Because, again, it seems like Michael doesn't put a lot of thought to things. Sorry, Michael, if you ever get a wind of this video. It seems like he doesn't put a lot of thought of things, and maybe he just took it as far as, well, if my son's been arrested for it, he must have done it. And maybe this is all in retrospect. Well, now that I know my son did it because he's been arrested for it, in retrospect, yeah, I don't want to look like the guy who didn't know this was coming. Maybe I'll now say, I kind of always had a feeling that it might be the case. So could it be that? 100% speculation. But could it be that? Well, if Michael Kohberger is a simple guy who believes that police don't arrest people unless they're guilty, and therefore his son being arrested means his son is guilty, then maybe in retrospect he gets interviewed about, hey, didn't you see this coming? And he's like, yeah, I kind of saw this coming. Because maybe he's just a simple guy that, and so who knows? Or maybe he really did have reasons to believe that he thinks his son was the killer of the Idaho 4. That cat's about to jump high. You see that? Did you see that look on Xander's face? Xander, you are not Batman. All right, Xander and I are signing off. Sign off.